It was 1:47 a.m. when the phone ripped through the silence of my little wooden house on the edge of Greenwood County. I almost didn't answer calls that late, only bring bad news. Mrs. Jones, this is Deputy Carter. We found a young man on County Road 14. We believe it's your son Daniel. For a second I forgot how to breathe. The coffee cup slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor. 10 minutes later, headlights carved through the darkness as I drove faster than I ever had, the old Ford rattling beneath me. The night smelled of wet soil and fear. When I reached the curve near mile 14, the flashing red and blue lights painted the trees like ghosts. And there he was, my boy, lying by the roadside, his shirt soaked in dark blood. "Daniel," I screamed, stumbling toward him. His lips trembled. His eyes fluttered open just long enough to whisper, "It wasn't an accident. It was my wife's father." Then his hand slipped from mine. The sound that left my throat didn't feel human. It was something primal, something that had slept deep inside me until that moment. The paramedics pushed me aside, shouting codes and numbers I couldn't understand. I saw one of them shaking his head. Someone tried to hold me back, but I broke free and knelt beside my son again, my hands covered in his blood. When they lifted him into the ambulance, I climbed in without asking. His head rested on my lap as the siren wailed through the empty highway. "Stay with me, baby," I begged, brushing the blood from his mouth. "You're gonna be fine. You always keep your promises, right?" His eyes moved faint and distant. I pressed his cold fingers against my cheek until the medic pulled me away to insert another line. The monitor beeped faster, then slower. I counted each sound like a heartbeat of hope. At the hospital, the bright lights burned my eyes. Doctors rushed him through the sliding doors, shouting, "Trauma room 3. Someone asked for paperwork, but all I could say was his name over and over like a prayer. "Daniel Jones. My son. My boy." A nurse guided me to the waiting area. I sat numb, my hands sticky with dried blood. The clock ticked. The walls smelled like bleach and despair. People came and went. I stayed frozen. When the surgeon finally appeared, his eyes said everything before his mouth did. "Mrs. Jones," he began softly, "we did everything we could." I didn't cry at first. I just stared at the white floor tiles and thought how my son hated white. It made him feel small, like he didn't belong in the offices where he worked. He used to joke, "One day, Mama, I'll wear white and make it look like power." I clutched that memory until it hurt. A deputy walked over with a clipboard. "We'll need a statement, ma'am," he said, eyes avoiding mine. "Looks like he lost control of his car and hit the guardrail. Classic midnight crash." I looked at him, my voice low and cold. "Did you see his face? Those bruises weren't from a seatbelt." He sighed, shrugged, and muttered, "Sometimes people drive too fast." Then he turned away. I sat there, staring at the door that separated me from my son's body. The room felt too clean, too bright for the truth that lived inside it. I pressed my palm to my chest, trying to hold my heart still. "It wasn't an accident," I whispered to no one. He told me. Outside, dawn began to stretch its pale fingers across the parking lot. I drove home on autopilot, my headlights cutting through the morning mist. The seat beside me was empty, his jacket folded neatly where he had left it the day before. It still smelled faintly of cedar and cologne. When I pulled into the driveway, the world looked the same. The porch light still flickered, the chickens clucked softly, but nothing was the same. Inside, I washed my hands in the kitchen sink, watching the water turn pink and swirl down the drain. The house was silent except for the ticking clock above the stove. I sat at the table staring at the cracked linoleum. For years, that table had seen everything: birthday candles, Sunday dinners, laughter. Now, it bore witness to something else: the beginning of war. The police called again around sunrise, asking if I wanted the car released to the impound. I hung up without answering. Instead, I stared out the window at the pecan tree Daniel planted when he was 16. He'd said, "One day it'll give shade to our grandkids." The branches moved gently in the breeze, as if bowing under a weight I couldn't see. I thought of his wife Lydia, the fancy clothes, the polite smile, the way she avoided looking me in the eye since her father decided I wasn't good company. Richard Whitmore. The man with the mansion on the hill. and the voice that dripped honey and venom at the same time. He'd looked at my son like he was dirt that dared to shine. My stomach twisted as I remembered Daniel's whisper, "It was my wife's father." The words looped through my head like a curse. I poured coffee into my cup and spilled half of it because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. "What kind of man beats another man and calls it justice?" I muttered. No one answered. Only the old radio crackled in the corner, playing a gospel song about deliverance. The irony was cruel. When the sun climbed higher, I went to the porch and sat on the step where Daniel used to tie his shoes before heading to work. My neighbor, old Mrs. Mabel, shuffled by on her morning walk. She stopped when she saw me. "Lord have mercy, Ruth Anna," I just heard. Her voice trembled. "I'm so sorry, baby." I nodded, unable to speak. She put a hand on my shoulder, but I barely felt it. After she left, I sat there for what felt like hours, watching the shadows move across the yard. The world was still spinning, but mine had stopped. I thought of my mother Clarice and her words when I was young, "The world ain't fair, Ruthie, but it always leaves footprints if you know where to look." That night I couldn't sleep. The house groaned with every gust of wind. I turned on the lamp and opened the drawer where I kept my old notebooks. Inside was one labeled, "For the Hard Days." I tore out a page and wrote 3 words in the center, "Find the truth." Then I folded it and slipped it into Daniel's jacket pocket, hanging by the door. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stared at the reflection in the window, an old woman with tired eyes and blood still under her fingernails. I whispered to the darkness, "You chose the wrong mother to break." Somewhere outside, a dog barked in the distance. The wind carried the faint hum of the highway where it had all begun. I closed my eyes and saw his face again, the way he'd tried to smile even through the pain. I promised him, silently, "I'll make them see you, son. I'll make them hear your name." The clock struck midnight again, marking exactly 24 hours since the call. The kitchen light flickered once, then steadied, shining on the note pinned to the refrigerator, the last grocery list Daniel had written. I reached out, traced his handwriting, and felt something harden inside me. They said it was an accident. They said it was fate. But I knew better. And if the law wouldn't bring justice for my son, then this mother would. The house was too quiet the next morning. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that presses on your chest until breathing feels like a chore. The coffee pot still sat half full from the night before, its smell sour and stale. I hadn't slept. Every creak in the floorboards reminded me of footsteps that would never come again. I folded the blanket on the couch, straightened the cushion, anything to keep my hands busy. When the knock came at the door, I jumped like a gun had gone off. It was Ezekiel. My brother's shoulders filled the doorway, same as when we were kids, but his eyes looked older, darker. He didn't say anything at first. He just stepped in and held me until my shaking stopped. "I came as soon as I heard," he murmured. His voice still carried that rough soldier's calm, that made you believe things would be okay, even when they weren't. I nodded, but the tears I'd been holding back for hours finally broke. "They said it was an accident, Zeke. But I saw him. Those bruises weren't from no accident." He guided me to the kitchen table, sat down opposite me, and folded his big hands. "Then it's not over," he said simply. The funeral was small. Too small for what Daniel deserved. Just a few friends from his office, neighbors, and folks from church. Pastor Clay spoke about light and forgiveness, but his words barely touched me. I watched the polished box lower into the ground, the red clay of Mississippi piling on top, and I thought how much he hated dirt under his nails. I wanted to scream that he should have been wearing a suit, not lying beneath one. After the last hymn faded, I stayed by the grave long after everyone left. The air smelled of rain, thick and heavy. My dress clung to my skin, and I didn't care. "You worked your whole life to be somebody, baby," I whispered. They couldn't stand to see it. When I finally turned away, Ezekiel was leaning against his truck, arms crossed. "Come on, sis," he said. "You'll catch cold." We rode home in silence. The windshield wipers beat a rhythm that matched the pounding in my chest. When we reached my driveway, he didn't turn off the engine. "You still got that fire in you," he said. "I can see it. Just don't let it burn you before it burns them." That night, the rain came down harder. I made a pot of soup neither of us touched. Ezekiel sat at the table with his notebook open, scribbling things down like he always did when thinking. I stared at the flame under the pot until it blurred. "Tell me everything," he said finally. So I did. From the phone call to Daniel's last words. When I got to the part about Richard Whitmore, Ezekiel's jaw clenched. "That man's name been poison in this county since before you were born," he said. "I fought in wars, Ruthie, but men like him, they fight dirtier." I leaned back exhausted. "He's got money connections, lawyers. We can't fight that." Ezekiel looked up. "Then we'll find another way. Mama used to say the law may be blind, but truth ain't deaf." I smiled faintly through the ache. "You still quoting Mama after all these years? She was right more often than not." He tore a page from his notebook and wrote at the top, "Daniel Jones case." Under it, one word, "justice." By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air sharp and cold. I stepped outside with my cup of coffee and watched the sunrise through the pecan branches. The earth was soaked, the grass flattened by rain. Daniel's footprints from yesterday had turned into puddles. Mrs. Mabel came by with biscuits wrapped in a towel. "You need to eat something," she said. I thanked her though, the thought of food made my stomach twist. She sat with me for a moment, clucking her tongue. "Don't go stirrin' trouble with that Whitmore man. Folks around here know what he's capable of." I didn't answer. I just looked out at the muddy yard and thought of the way Richard's car had gleamed under those police lights, untouched by rain or guilt. When she left, I went back inside. Ezekiel was already at the table, spreading papers and notes. "I made a few calls," he said. "Got a friend who still works near the sheriff's office. Seems like the official report was signed off mighty quick. No autopsy yet, but they're ready to close it." "They're protecting him," I said. "They always protect their own," he replied. "But this time we'll make sure they choke on it." He tore open a brown envelope and laid out photos from the crash site he'd borrowed from his contact. "Look at this," he said, pointing. "Guardrails clean. No fresh paint from Daniel's car. That means no impact. But they said he hit it head on." I felt my throat tighten. So they lied. They did more than lie. They covered up. The words settled heavy in the room. Ezekiel stood pacing. "We'll need names, times, every detail. Think Ruthie, who'd want to scare him, who'd gain from it." My mind replayed Daniel's wedding day 3 years ago. The Whitmore mansion lit like a palace, my son, standing nervous beside a woman he loved more than life. Richard had pulled me aside before the ceremony, his voice sugar-sweet and cruel. "Keep your family quiet," he'd said. "We don't need gossip ruining our name." The memory burned in my gut. "It was always about pride," I murmured. He couldn't stand that his daughter married a man without money. Ezekiel scribbled in his notebook again. Then pride just became motive. We spent the rest of the day digging through boxes of Daniel's things. His work ID, a few receipts, a small notebook where he kept reminders. One caught my eye: meeting with Mr. W Tuesday 5:30 p.m. That was the night he died. I held the page up, my heart thudding. He was meeting Richard. Ezekiel looked at the note, then at me. "There's your trail, sis." Evening came with another knock. This time it was Lydia. She stood on the porch, eyes red, makeup smeared. The coral dress she wore at the funeral clung to her like regret. "I just came to say I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know he'd do this." I stepped back, my voice hard. "You knew what kind of man your father was." Tears rolled down her face. "I thought he just wanted to scare him." "Not." She couldn't finish. Ezekiel folded his arms. "You better go before someone sees you here." But I stopped him. "Let her speak." She handed me an envelope. "He sent this. Said it's to help with expenses." I couldn't keep it. Inside were crisp $100 bills. Blood money. I threw it into the sink and turned on the faucet, watching the paper curl and drown. Lydia gasped. "You tell your father," I said, "that my son's worth ain't something he can count." She nodded, trembling. "He's planning something, Miss Ruth. He's scared. He knows you're asking questions." "Good," Ezekiel said. "Let him be scared for once." After she left, I stood by the window watching her car disappear down the dirt road. The sun had already dipped below the trees, leaving a smear of orange in the sky. Ezekiel spoke softly behind me. "You sure you trust her?" "I don't know," I said. "But I know what I saw in her eyes. Fear. And guilt. That means she's seen the truth." He nodded. "Then we use that." Night crept in again, slow and heavy. I washed the dishes that weren't dirty, wiped the counter twice, couldn't sit still. Every sound outside made my heart jump. When I finally settled at the kitchen table, Ezekiel joined me with 2 mugs of coffee. We didn't talk for a while. The ticking clock filled the silence between us. "You remember what Mama used to say?" he asked. "The world don't hand out fairness. You gotta carve it yourself." I nodded. "Then we better find a sharp knife." He smiled for the first time since he arrived. "We will. Tomorrow we start asking questions." I looked at the empty chair across from me, the one Daniel used to sit in when he came home for Sunday dinners. The cushion still had the dent from his weight. I reached over, touched it gently and whispered, "We're coming for you, baby. I promise." Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the sound of distant thunder. The storm was gone, but another was already building. I still remember that June afternoon 3 years ago, when the Whitmore mansion looked like something out of a magazine. Marble floors that could blind you, chandeliers that dripped like frozen rain, and people who stared at me as if I'd wandered in from the wrong world. I stood near the back, clutching the little purse I'd bought at the thrift store, trying to pretend my dress wasn't homemade. Daniel was up front, nervous and handsome in his suit, and Lydia, God bless her, was glowing like she'd swallowed the sun. But even her smile dimmed when her father walked in. Richard Whitmore didn't need to speak to make people move. He carried his wealth like a weapon, invisible but sharp. His silver hair slicked back his ring, catching the light every time he raised his glass. He looked at me once, and smiled the way a man smiles at something he's already decided to buy or throw away. That was the first moment I knew our families would never speak the same language. Before the ceremony, he asked to see Daniel privately. My boy thought it was a blessing, maybe even a truce. I waited outside the study, counting the seconds. When the door finally opened, Daniel's face was pale, his hands shaking. I pulled him aside. "What happened?" He took a deep breath. "He offered me money, Mama. $50,000 to leave Lydia and disappear." I felt the blood rush to my head. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him love ain't for sale." Pride swelled inside me even as fear coiled tight around my ribs. "Then you better be ready," I said quietly. "Men like him don't take no as an answer." During the ceremony, I saw Richard watching us instead of his daughter. Every vow Daniel spoke made the man's jaw tighten. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Richard didn't clap. He just raised his glass again and muttered something to the man beside him. The smile never reached his eyes. At the reception, I stood near the buffet, trying to blend into the wallpaper. The air smelled of champagne and arrogance. A woman in a pearl necklace leaned toward her friend and whispered, "That's his mother, the one who used to sell pies at the farmer's market." They giggled like schoolgirls. Richard took the microphone to make a toast. "My friends," he began, his voice warm as velvet. "Tonight our family grows in an unexpected direction. My daughter has chosen love over lineage, and while that's admirable, I hope this union teaches us all the importance of rising above one's circumstances." Laughter rippled through the room. Lydia's smile faltered. Daniel looked at me helplessly. I just nodded silently, telling him to hold his head high. Afterward, when everyone was dancing, I slipped outside for air. The night smelled of roses and chlorine from the pool. I turned and found Richard behind me, cigar glowing like a small sun. "You must be proud," he said, exhaling smoke that curled between us. "I am," I answered. He smiled thinly. "Your son's a lucky man. Not many people get to climb this high from so low." I stared at him. "My son didn't climb anywhere. He walked on his own 2 feet. He chuckled. "Then let's hope they don't give out." I didn't reply. I just walked away, the sound of his laughter following me down the marble steps. For a while, things seemed calm. Daniel and Lydia moved into a small apartment on the south side of town. He got promoted at work and she taught art classes. They visited on Sundays, bringing groceries and stories. Lydia was too sweet for her father's world. But even then I saw the cracks forming. One Sunday she came alone. Her eyes were red. "He's cutting us off," she said. "Dad says he won't help with the down payment for the new house unless Daniel signs over half of his shares in the firm." Daniel refused, of course. Pride runs deep in our blood. But pride doesn't pay bills. They started fighting more. Lydia tried to keep the peace, but Richard had planted a seed of doubt, watering it with every visit. At Christmas, he invited the whole family to his estate. I didn't want to go, but Daniel said it's time we show them we're not afraid. The mansion was glittering again, the smell of pine and expensive candles filling every corner. The dinner table stretched longer than the hallway of my entire house. I sat at one end, Richard at the other. Halfway through the meal, he raised his glass and said, "I suppose this year we should all be grateful. Some of us have risen higher than expected." Lydia's fork clinked against her plate. Daniel set his down carefully. "I'm grateful, sir," he said evenly, "but not for your approval." Richard's smile turned to stone. "Then perhaps you should find gratitude in a smaller dining room next year." The silence that followed could have cracked glass. I reached under the table and squeezed my son's hand. He didn't flinch. After dinner, Lydia found me in the hall. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I didn't know he'd say those things. I looked at her, really looked at her, the trembling lips, the bruised soul behind her perfect face. "You love him?" I asked. "Yes." "Then love him honestly. Don't hide behind that family name." She nodded, tears shining like pearls. I touched her cheek gently. "You remind me of my younger self," I said. Believing love could fix broken men. When Daniel and I left that night, I turned back once. Through the tall windows, I saw Richard standing alone by the fireplace, staring at his reflection in the glass. It wasn't victory I saw in his eyes, it was fear. After that, things changed. Daniel worked longer hours. Lydia called less. Every time she did, her voice sounded thinner. Once she whispered, "He's watching us, Miss Ruth. I think he has people following Daniel." I told her to come stay with me for a while, but she said no. "He'd find out," she said, "and it would make things worse." Then came that Tuesday evening, the one written in Daniel's notebook. He'd told me he was meeting Richard to settle things. I begged him not to go. "He's not like us," I warned. "He doesn't know mercy." Daniel smiled, kissed my forehead. "Don't worry, Mama. It's just talk." Now I hear those words in my sleep every night. Just talk. If I had known that conversation would end with my boy bleeding by the roadside, I would have stood in front of his car to stop him. But life doesn't give warnings, it gives echoes. And that night, the echo of Richard's voice carried farther than I could imagine. I've replayed every moment of that wedding in my mind since the funeral, the laughter, the whispers, the toast that cut like glass. That was the beginning. The night they called us low class with smiles on their faces. The night my son became a target for a man too proud to see him as human. Now sitting at my kitchen table years later, I understand something I didn't then. It wasn't love that doomed Daniel, it was arrogance. And arrogance always pays its debt. Ezekiel says we'll need proof before anyone listens. Maybe he's right, but I don't need a court to tell me the truth. I saw it the day my son said I do and his father-in-law refused to clap. That was the moment I lost him. And the moment Richard Whitmore earned an enemy who wouldn't rest until justice called his name. The morning after Daniel's funeral, the air hung thick with the smell of wet soil and lilies. I couldn't sit still. The house felt too small for the weight in my chest, so I took my coffee to the porch and watched the mist crawl off the fields. The world had gone back to its rhythm, but mine was broken. I kept expecting to hear his car pull into the driveway, his voice calling out, "Mama, I brought breakfast." Instead, there was only the creak of the rocking chair and the hollow song of the mourning doves. Ezekiel came out holding a folder under his arm. "You ready to move?" he asked. His eyes had that soldier's calm again, the kind that hides fear behind purpose. "We can't wait for them to bury the truth, Ruthie." I nodded. My voice didn't work, but my hands did. I put on my old boots, grabbed my coat, and followed him to the truck. The road stretched ahead like a scar cutting through the pine trees. I'd driven it 100 times before, but that day it felt like a path into something darker. We started with the sheriff's office. The smell of stale coffee and disinfectant hit me the moment we walked in. Deputy Carter, the same man who'd called me that night, looked up from his desk. "Mrs. Jones," he said stiffly, "I'm real sorry for your loss." "Sorry don't fix lies," Ezekiel said, leaning on the counter. "We want to see the accident report." The deputy hesitated. "That's confidential." I stepped forward. "That's my son." He looked around, lowered his voice, and handed me a copy. "I shouldn't be giving you this," he whispered. "But I got a family too." Back in the truck, Ezekiel unfolded the papers. "See this," he said, pointing to the section labeled Witness Statements. 2 names, one's a tow truck driver, the other's a highway worker. Both claim they saw nothing. But the timestamp on the tow report says they arrived before the police did. "So someone called them early," I said slowly. "Exactly." He tapped the page. "The same way they knew to clean it up." We drove out to County Road 14 again, the place where my world had split open. The dirt still showed the faint marks of tire tracks, though the rain had tried to wash them away. The guardrail gleamed untouched. No dents, no paint, no sign of collision. Ezekiel crouched down, studying the ground. "Look here," he said, brushing away the mud. 2 sets of footprints. One heavier, one lighter. They lead toward the ditch, then back to the road. I stared at the spot where Daniel's blood had soaked into the earth. The grass had grown over it, but I could still see it. I could still smell it. "He was dragged," I whispered. Ezekiel looked up. "Yeah. And someone wanted us to believe it was an accident." The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of gasoline. I turned and saw a small patch of blackened dirt near the trees, burned just enough to hide something, not enough to destroy it. Ezekiel kicked through the ashes and pulled out a melted piece of plastic. It looked like part of a phone casing. "Daniel's?" he asked. "I don't know. But he never went anywhere without it." We took it home and cleaned the soot off in the sink. The casing had a faint logo, his phone model. I turned it over in my hands, imagining the last call he made, the last words he heard. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen with the light off, staring at that broken phone. Around midnight, headlights flashed outside. My heart leapt into my throat. I peeked through the curtain and saw a black SUV parked at the end of the road. It didn't move. I woke Ezekiel. He came to the window, eyes narrowing. "That's not random," he said. "Get your things." We killed the lights and watched. After 10 minutes, the SUV drove away slowly, no plates visible. Ezekiel didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was low. "They're watching you, Ruthie. That means we're close to something." The next morning, we decided to visit someone who might still owe us the truth. Deputy Miller, a retired officer who'd worked under the old sheriff back when the Whitmores were expanding their real estate empire. He lived out near the river in a small trailer surrounded by rusted cars. Miller opened the door halfway, eyes wary. "You folks selling something?" "No," I said. "We're looking for the truth." Ezekiel handed him the report. "You ever see a case closed this fast?" The man's jaw tightened. He motioned us inside. The air smelled like tobacco and dust. "You're stirring a hornet's nest," he said quietly. "The Whitmores own half the county. Always have. Back in my day, they'd buy the land cheap after something happened to its owners." "What kind of something?" I asked. "Fires. Accidents. Disappearances." He glanced toward the window. "Some of those cases were never filed at all." Ezekiel leaned forward. "You saying they've been doing this for decades?" Miller nodded slowly. "Old man Whitmore started it. Richard just polished the method." I felt my stomach twist. "You ever hear the name Clarice Johnson?" He frowned. "Your mama, yeah, she worked for them. Good woman. Smart. Kept notes on everything." "She did," I said softly. "And maybe it's time we opened them." When we left his trailer, Ezekiel didn't speak until we were halfway down the dirt road. "Mama's notebooks," he said. You still got them, in the attic, I answered. Haven't touched them since she passed. That night the wind rattled the house like a warning. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I climbed the attic ladder, flashlight in hand. Dust floated like ghosts in the beam of light. The air smelled of cedar and thyme. There it was, a small wooden chest with a brass latch. I knelt and opened it. Inside were old photos, letters, and a leather-bound notebook. My mother's handwriting curved neatly across the first page. For my children, one day you'll need to know who really owns this town. I turned the pages, reading names, land deeds, bribes, even initials that matched the current police chief. Ezekiel joined me, eyes scanning the pages quickly. She wrote down everything he said. Payments, threats, the year, even the amounts. And here I said, pointing to a line from 1963, Whitmore paid Sheriff Moore $2,000 for silence after Carter fire. Carter, Ezekiel whispered. The family that vanished. I closed the book carefully, my hands trembling. Mama knew. She tried to warn us. Below the floorboards creaked. I froze. Ezekiel signaled for silence. We heard the faint crunch of footsteps outside the house, then the slow creak of the gate. He grabbed his rifle from behind the door and motioned for me to stay put. The night pressed against the windows like a living thing. After a long minute he came back whispering, "No one there, but the mailbox is open." He stepped out, gun in hand, and returned with a plain envelope. Inside was a single photograph, grainy and dark. It showed Daniel's car by the roadside, 2 men dragging his body toward the ditch. And behind them, the unmistakable silhouette of a silver Mercedes. My knees gave out. Ezekiel caught me before I hit the floor. "Mercedes," I whispered. "That's Richard's car." Ezekiel's voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "Then we've got our proof." I stared at the photo under the dim attic light, the faces blurred, but the truth screaming clear. The past and present had collided, my mother's secrets, my son's death, all tied to one name. I closed my eyes and heard her voice again, faint but sure. "The wealthy think we don't remember, but we do." That night, as the wind howled outside and thunder rolled over the hills, I made myself a promise. I would not let Daniel become another forgotten name in a long list of Whitmore sins. By morning they would know his mother was coming for them. The sun hadn't risen yet when I heard Ezekiel moving around the kitchen. The floorboards creaked under his boots, and the smell of coffee drifted through the air. He was already dressed, sleeves rolled up, eyes sharp. "We need copies of that photo," he said. "And the notebook." I sat at the table, still in my robe, the chill of dawn crawling up my arms. "If they know we have it," I murmured, "they'll come for us." He poured 2 cups and set one in front of me. "They already came once. This time, we'll be ready." The clock ticked softly between us. For a moment I thought of Mama's voice, steady and calm even in storms. "If you ever find yourself surrounded, child, remember truth's the only weapon that never jams." By 7 we were in town. Greenwood was just waking up, sunlight bleeding over the rooftops. People waved as we passed, unaware that their peace sat on land bought with blood. We stopped by a small printing shop where the owner, Mr. Harris, owed Ezekiel an old favor from their army days. "I need these copied and sealed," Ezekiel told him, sliding the envelope across the counter. Mr. Harris's face drained of color when he saw the photo. "Good Lord. You sure you want this on paper?" "More sure than anything I've done in years," I said quietly. He hesitated, then nodded. "Give me an hour." We sat in the diner across the street while we waited. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and kind hands, recognized me. "Miss Ruth, I heard about your boy," she said softly. "He was a good one, always tipped well." "Thank you," I whispered. The words stuck in my throat. Ezekiel squeezed my hand under the table, grounding me. When we returned, Mr. Harris handed us a manila folder. "Made 5 copies, 1 for you, 1 for me in case something happens, and 3 in safe deposit boxes." Ezekiel grinned. "You always did think like a soldier." As we stepped outside, a black sedan passed slowly by the shop. The tinted windows reflected the morning sun, but I felt eyes on us. My stomach tightened. "Zeke," I whispered. "I see it," he said, hand resting near his jacket pocket. The car didn't stop, it just turned the corner and disappeared. Back home, I laid out the copies on the table beside Mama's notebook. Each line of her handwriting glowed like firelight. The truth was staring back at us in ink and memory. Then, the phone rang. I hesitated before answering. A man's voice, distorted and low, came through the receiver. "If you care about what's left of your family, you'll stop digging." "Who is this?" I demanded. Silence, then a click. The line went dead. Ezekiel was already dialing the operator to trace the number, but she said it was unlisted. He slammed the phone down. "They're getting nervous," he said. "Good, that means we're close." I went to the window. The pecan tree swayed gently, its leaves whispering like old ghosts. "Close to what, Zeke?" I asked. "Justice or danger, both," he said. "Usually the same thing." Later that afternoon, Lydia arrived without warning. She looked pale, her hair undone, eyes red from crying. She clutched a purse like it was holding her whole life together. "I can't stay long," she said, stepping inside. "Father's been different, paranoid. He keeps talking on the phone in his study. Yesterday I overheard him say something about cleaning up the mess." Ezekiel leaned forward. "You mean Daniel?" She nodded slowly. "He's scared someone will connect him to the attack. He thinks one of his men took pictures." My pulse quickened. "Then maybe that man's the reason we have this photo." Lydia's voice trembled. "There's more. He keeps a safe in his office at home. It's behind a painting of my mother. I've seen him hide envelopes there, cash documents, sometimes flash drives." Ezekiel exchanged a glance with me. "That's what we need." "No," she said quickly. "You don't understand. His security team watches every room. If he catches me, he'll cut. He's already done the worst he can do. I cut in. He took my son. You can't let him take your soul too." She stared at me, tears spilling over. Then she nodded. "I'll get what I can." Ezekiel walked her to the door. "Be careful," he warned. "And if anything feels wrong, call from a payphone, not your house." After she left, he turned to me. "You think we can trust her?" "I don't think," I said. "I believe." And that's enough for now. The next few days stretched thin. We waited, each hour slower than the last. I baked pies just to keep my hands busy, but the smell of sweet potatoes reminded me of Daniel's laughter. He used to sneak bites before they cooled. I'd scold him and he'd grin like a child. The memory hurt more than it healed. On the third night, the phone rang again. This time it was Lydia. Her voice was shaking. "I did it," she whispered. "I have the documents. Land deeds, contracts, things that prove my father bought people's silence. I'll bring them tomorrow morning." "Where are you now?" I asked. "Still at the mansion." "He's out of town till dawn." "But I think someone saw me. There was a car outside when I left the study." "Go to the guest house," I told her. "Hide there until sunrise." "I can't," she said. "If they find me missing, they'll search everywhere. I'll call again when I'm safe." The line cut off. Ezekiel paced the floor, fists clenched. "She's walking into a trap." "We all are," I said quietly. "But she's the only one who can open the door." We didn't sleep. Every sound outside set our nerves on edge. At one point, headlights flashed again at the end of the road, same SUV as before. This time it stayed for nearly an hour. By dawn, it was gone. But in its place, our mailbox hung open again. Another envelope waited inside, unmarked. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside were 2 photographs, one of Ezekiel and me at the diner yesterday, and one of Lydia leaving the Whitmore mansion that same night. "Jesus," Ezekiel muttered. "They're watching all of us." My knees went weak. "Then it's begun," I whispered. "The part Mama warned about." He looked at me sharply. "What part?" I walked to the shelf and pulled out her notebook again. On the final page, written in darker ink than the rest, were her last words. "When the truth starts to burn, it means they're close enough to feel the heat." Ezekiel stared at the line, then at me. "Then let's make it burn brighter." He grabbed his coat and keys. "I'm going to Jackson tomorrow. I know a man in the U.S. Attorney's office who still owes me. If we can get these documents, we'll have a case they can't bury." I looked out the window at the rising sun. The light cut through the fog, turning the fields gold. Somewhere out there, the Whitmore mansion glittered like a false crown. "Be careful," I said softly. "They don't fight fair." He smiled faintly. "Neither do we." When he drove away, the wind picked up, scattering leaves across the porch. I stood there for a long time, watching the road disappear into the trees, my heart split between fear and fury. Then I went inside, sat at the table, and opened Mama's notebook one more time. I traced her handwriting with my finger, feeling her strength travel through the paper into my bones. "You were right, Mama," I whispered. "They think we're just dust under their boots." But dust remembers. Outside, thunder rumbled far in the distance. The storm was coming back. Only this time I wasn't afraid. Because this time it had my name on it. The wind came in restless waves that morning, rattling the pecan branches against my roof. I had just set a pie in the oven when a car door slammed outside. Through the window, I saw Lydia stepping out, clutching a manila folder so tight her knuckles were white. Her hair was messy, her face pale, and her eyes carried the kind of fear only truth can cause. I opened the door before she could knock. "You made it," I said. Barely she breathed. "He came home early. I had to climb out the back window." Ezekiel appeared from the hallway, tucking his shirt into his jeans. "You bring what we need." Lydia nodded and handed him the folder. Everything I could find: contracts, bank transfers, photographs of the people he paid off. We sat around the table as Ezekiel opened the folder. Inside were papers covered in official stamps and signatures, numbers that stretched across columns like veins. My eyes caught one name immediately: Jerome Carter. The same name Mama had written decades ago in her notebook beside the word "missing." "What's this?" I asked. Lydia leaned forward. "My father's fixer. He handled the dirty work. If someone refused to sell their property or spoke out against him, Jerome made sure they changed their mind or disappeared." Ezekiel whistled low. "That's the man in the burned-down Carter case from '63. Mama wrote about him." Lydia nodded. "He worked for my grandfather first. When he died, my father took him on. I think Jerome wanted out years ago, but my father owns him, his debts, his family." Ezekiel flipped to another document. It was a list of property transfers signed over to Whitmore Development, LLC. Next to each name was a notation: paid in cash, silence confirmed. I felt something twist in my stomach. "That's blood money," I said quietly. Lydia's voice broke. "He told me once that every empire needs sacrifice." I didn't understand what he meant until now. We went through each page line by line. The deeper we read, the colder the room felt. There were police officers listed, judges, even a state senator. My hands trembled as I traced each signature. "He's been running this whole town," I whispered. "And everyone's been letting him." Ezekiel closed the folder. "Not anymore." Lydia looked at us, her eyes glassy. "He'll know I took them." There were cameras in the office, I saw the light blinking. "If he reviews the footage, he'll see me." Ezekiel stood. "Then we have to move before he does." He walked to the counter, pulling out a map of Greenwood County. If Jerome's still around, he might be the key. The man's neck deep in this, but he's also got everything to lose. Maybe he's ready to talk. "How do we find him?" I asked. Ezekiel tapped the map. "Mama mentioned in her notes he used to live near the old railway yard, abandoned now. If he's hiding, that's where he'll be." Lydia shifted nervously. "You can't go there alone. My father has men everywhere. They don't wear badges, but they're armed." Ezekiel smiled faintly. "Good thing I'm not afraid of men with guns." I touched his arm. "You're not going without me." He hesitated, but I didn't give him time to argue. Mama didn't raise us to sit behind curtains while others fought our battles. By late afternoon we were driving down the dirt road that led to the old rail yard. The sky hung heavy, and gray thunder rumbling in the distance. We parked behind a cluster of rusted freight cars. Ezekiel scanned the area with his binoculars, then motioned for me to stay low. A faint light flickered inside one of the old storage buildings. We moved quietly, our boots crunching on gravel. When we reached the door, Ezekiel knocked twice. No answer. He tried again. A voice came from inside. "Who's there, friends?" Ezekiel said. "We just want to talk." After a pause, the door creaked open. A man in his late 50s stood there, gaunt and cautious. His left eye was clouded and a jagged scar ran down his cheek. "I don't take kindly to visitors," he rasped. Ezekiel held up his hands. "We're not here for trouble, Jerome. We just want to know what happened to my nephew." The man froze. "Daniel Jones, yes," I said. "My son." He studied my face for a long moment. Then he sighed, stepping aside. "You better come in." The inside of the building smelled of oil and rust. A single lamp cast a weak light over a table cluttered with papers. He sat down heavily, rubbing his hands together. "Your boy didn't deserve what happened," he said quietly. My throat tightened. "Then tell me who did it." He looked up. "You already know. Your boss?" He nodded. "Richard Whitmore gave the order. Said the boy needed to learn respect." The words hit like stones. "You were there?" Ezekiel asked. Jerome hesitated. "I drove the car. 2 of his men did the beating." He watched from his Mercedes. I gripped the edge of the table until my fingers hurt. "And you let it happen?" His voice cracked. "You think I wanted to?" He had my son locked in county jail on fake charges. Said he'd make them disappear if I followed orders. I thought I could protect my family. I was wrong. Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "We have evidence, documents, photos, payment records. Help us, and we can end this." Jerome shook his head. "You don't know what you're up against. The sheriff, the judge, half the council, they're all in his pocket." But he reached under the table and pulled out a small box. Inside were cassette tapes and a handful of photographs. "I've been keeping my own insurance. Every job he made me do, I recorded the orders." He handed me one tape labeled April 12, highway job. "That's your son's night," he said. "His voice is on it." I stared at the box like it was a bomb. "Why give this to me now?" "Because I'm tired," he said simply. "And because I can't sleep, knowing your boy's ghost is walking around my head." Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the windows. Ezekiel took the box, wrapping it in his jacket. "We'll get it to someone who can use it." Jerome stood and looked at me. "You be careful, ma'am. Richard already suspects there's a leak. If he figures out it's me, he'll kill us both." "We'll protect you," I promised. He smiled bitterly. "Ain't no protection from men like him. Only exposure." Outside, the rain started to fall in sheets. We ran to the truck, the box clutched against Ezekiel's chest. As we pulled away, lightning flashed behind us, illuminating Jerome's silhouette in the doorway. For a second, I thought I saw peace on his face. We drove in silence, the wipers squealing against the glass. "You think he'll make it through the night?" I asked. Ezekiel's voice was grim. "If Richard knows he talked, he won't." When we reached home, Lydia was waiting, pacing the porch. "Did you find him?" she asked. "We did," I said, holding up the box. "And he gave us the truth." Ezekiel set it on the table and unwrapped it. We stared at the tapes, each one marked with a date, like a countdown of sins. The room was quiet except for the rain drumming on the roof. I touched one of the tapes gently, almost afraid. "This is it," I said. "The proof he can't bury." Ezekiel nodded. "Tomorrow we take it to the authorities in Jackson. Somewhere outside his reach." Lydia looked out the window. Her voice trembled. "If you're right, he already knows what you took. He'll come for all of us." I turned toward her. "Then let him. I've lived my whole life afraid of men like your father. It's time he learned to be afraid of a mother with nothing left to lose." The thunder rolled again, closer this time. The power flickered, then steadied. Ezekiel rewound one of the tapes, and for a brief moment Daniel's voice came through, a faint laugh cut short by another man's tone, sharp and cruel. I felt the world stop. I closed my eyes, tears streaming silently down my face. "You hear that, baby?" I whispered. "We found you." Outside, the storm raged harder, but inside, something steadier began to grow fierce and certain. It was the sound of a mother's heart turning grief into justice. The attic smelled like cedar and dust, like the years that had passed since Mama's hands last touched these walls. The storm outside had quieted to a drizzle, each drop tapping gently against the old tin roof as if urging me on. I stood at the top of the ladder, flashlight in hand, while Ezekiel moved boxes aside. "There," he said, pointing. "That's the chest she used to keep locked." I knelt down, brushed the dust away, and opened it. Inside lay the things of another lifetime: yellowed photographs, lace handkerchiefs, brittle letters tied with string. But beneath them, wrapped in faded cloth, was what I had come for. A thick leather-bound book with the spine cracked and rust stains along the edges. The initials on the cover read C. J. Clarice Johnson. My breath caught. "Mama's ledger," I whispered. Ezekiel crouched beside me. "Let's see what she wanted us to know." We carried it downstairs to the kitchen, setting it on the table like something sacred. Lydia joined us, her face pale from a sleepless night. The moment I opened the first page, the smell of old ink filled the air. Mama's handwriting danced across the paper in looping curls, steady and careful. "The Whitmores think the poor forget. But memory is the soil truth grows from. I've seen things that will matter one day. If you are reading this, that day has come." I ran my fingers over the words, my throat tightening. "She knew," I murmured. Ezekiel nodded, flipping the next page. There were dates, names, payments, all written in that same deliberate hand. Each entry told a story. The 12th of May 1959. Mr. Whitmore paid Sheriff Moore $500 to clear the Carter land. Told me to burn the deeds after copying them. I didn't. The 7th of August 1960. The Morales family refused to sell. 2 days later, their barn caught fire. I saw Whitmore's truck pass the road that night. Lydia covered her mouth. "My grandfather," she whispered. "He did all of this." "He started it," I said softly. "Your father just perfected it." We turned another page. The ink was darker, the handwriting firmer, as if Mama's anger had begun to bleed through. The 4th of June 1963. Jerome Carter came to the mansion late, heard shouting. "Mr. Whitmore Sr. said, 'You either make them disappear, or you disappear with them.'" I wrote down every word. Ezekiel leaned back in his chair. She was documenting crimes before anyone believed women like her could even write their names on property papers. I smiled faintly through the sting in my chest. Mama always said we didn't need fancy schooling to know right from wrong. As the night wore on, the three of us pored over every line. The rain stopped, but the air inside felt heavy, thick with ghosts. On one page, tucked between loose sheets, I found a photograph faded and cracked. It showed the old Whitmore estate, and standing beside it, two men shaking hands. One was unmistakably Richard's father. The other, younger and dark-skinned, looked terrified. "That's Jerome," Ezekiel said quietly. Lydia stared at it, trembling. "He's been in their shadow his whole life." I turned the photo over. Mama's note on the back read, "Deals sealed in daylight, paid for in darkness." For a moment, none of us spoke. I could almost hear Mama's voice again, calm and certain. "Keep your eyes open, Ruthie. Evil doesn't always hide it, just counts on you looking away." Ezekiel flipped to the final section of the ledger. "There's something else," he said. The handwriting here was unsteady, written near the end of Mama's life. March 1982. Harrison Whitmore inherited the estate. Same arrogance, new polish. They call him Richard now. He built towers where others lost homes. Same blood, same greed. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. She was warning us even then. Lydia wiped her face. "If we connect this ledger with the evidence I took and the tapes from Jerome, it's enough to prove everything." "Then we'll do it," I said. "We'll use the same system that tried to bury us." Ezekiel rubbed his temples. "We'll need to verify these documents legally, find witnesses, notarize copies, maybe contact the Department of Justice in Jackson." Lydia nodded slowly. "I know someone there. A reporter who's been digging into my father's development deals. She's been waiting for something like this. Then she's about to get the story of her life," Ezekiel said. I turned another page and stopped. Part of it had been torn out. The edges were jagged, the ink smudged. Only one line remained legible. "Property hash owned for C. Jerome Carter," again I said. Ezekiel frowned. That missing page might have had details about the last land he took. Maybe the piece Richard used to start his fortune. Lydia leaned closer. If we can find what property Hajon 4 was, it might tie everything together. Then we'll ask him, I said. He's the only one left, who knows? Ezekiel closed the book carefully. Tomorrow, we go back to the rail yard. The wind outside picked up again, shaking the shutters. I stared down at Mama's ledger, the weight of it pressing against my heart. She wrote all this to protect us, I whispered. And now it's time to finish what she started. Lydia looked at me, her eyes red but resolute. I'll help. I owe Daniel that much. I reached across the table and took her hand. You don't owe him. You're part of this family now. That means you fight with us. For a moment her face softened. No one's ever called me family before, she said. You earned it, Ezekiel said gruffly. By standing up when it mattered. The clock struck midnight. We sat there, 3 people bound not by blood but by loss, by the kind of truth that demands to be seen. The air smelled like rain and old paper and courage. I flipped the ledger shut and placed it beside Daniel's photograph. His smile seemed different now, almost proud, almost peaceful. Your grandmother kept the record, I whispered. Your uncle found the evidence. Your wife risked her life. Now it's my turn, son. Outside, the moon broke through the clouds, spilling silver light through the window. It fell across the ledger, catching the gold threads of Mama's initials. I remembered the last thing she ever told me before she died. Justice don't come running, baby. You have to walk toward it even if your feet bleed. I stood up, wiped my tears, and took a deep breath. Then we walk, I said. Lydia smiled faintly. What will you do first? I looked toward the dark horizon beyond the trees. We find Jerome. And then we find every piece of truth they thought was buried. The wind outside carried the faint smell of earth after rain, and for the first time since Daniel's death, I felt something like peace. Not the quiet kind, but the kind that comes before movement, the stillness of a mother ready to fight again. I blew out the candle, leaving only the moonlight on the ledger. The room seemed to hum with Mama's presence, her strength woven into every line of ink she left behind. When I finally spoke, it was barely more than a whisper. They think they wrote this town's history, I said. But Mama wrote the real one. And tomorrow, we'll make the world read it. The knock came just after midnight, 3 soft taps against the back door. Ezekiel was up before I was, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol he kept under the counter. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the air still smelled like thunder. When he opened the door, a tall, thin man stood in the shadows, the brim of his cap dripping water. You don't know me, ma'am, he said when I stepped forward, his voice rough and low. But your mother once saved my life. Name's Jerome Carter. For a moment, all I could do was stare. The name hit me like a memory come to life. His face was older than I'd imagined, scar running from ear to jaw, eyes heavy with years of guilt. He looked past me to the kitchen table where Mama's ledger lay open beneath the lamplight. She kept it, he murmured. She did, I said quietly. And she wrote your name. He nodded, removing his cap. Then I guess it's time I tell you why. Ezekiel motioned him in. Jerome hesitated before stepping across the threshold, as if afraid the house itself would judge him. He sat down slowly, hands trembling. Your mother was the only one who ever treated me like a person, he said. When I worked for Whitmore Sr., she used to bring me coffee during those long nights. Told me someday people like us would be heard. I poured him a cup now the same way Mama had. Then make her right, I said. Tell us what you know. He took a sip, his fingers tightening around the mug. I worked for the Whitmores for 10 years. Security collections, whatever they called it. When Richard took over, things changed. He got smarter, crueler. Stopped hiding behind contracts and started using people like me to do his dirty work. Ezekiel leaned forward. How many people Jerome let out? A shaky breath. More than I can count. Farmers who refused to sell, families who owed money, men who talked too loud. He'd send us to convince them. Sometimes it was threats, sometimes it wasn't. My stomach twisted, and Daniel Jerome's eyes dropped to the floor. He was supposed to be a warning, not a death. Richard said, "Teach that boy his place." But those men, Griffin and Hark, went too far. He just watched from his car and told me to clean it up. Said if I didn't, my own son would be next. The words hit me like a slap. I felt the heat rise in my chest, my hands curling into fists. Ezekiel's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. Jerome looked up again, eyes full of regret. I wanted to run. But men like Whitmore, they own everything, your debts, your silence, your fear. So I started keeping records. Photos, receipts, recordings. I knew one day someone would come looking. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope, setting it gently on the table. Everything I have on him between 2015 and now. Not everything Mama wrote, but enough to make him bleed. Ezekiel opened it. Inside were photographs of property deeds, bank slips, even surveillance stills of Richard meeting with men in dark suits. One document caught my eye, Project Sunrise. "What's that?" I asked. Jerome rubbed his temples. A development deal on land taken from poor families under false contracts. They used shell companies to buy it cheap, then flipped it to corporations for millions. That's what Daniel found out why Richard wanted him gone. He was working at the county office, saw the files, started asking questions. "He died for that," I whispered. Jerome nodded slowly. He died because he was honest. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sound was the rain starting up again, soft against the windows. Finally, Ezekiel said, "We can use this. We take it to the feds in Jackson, not local cops. He can't buy them all." Jerome shook his head. "You don't get it. The sheriff, the district attorney, they're part of it. They'll warn him the minute your car hits the highway. If you want to take Whitmore down, you do it loud, public. Make it so big he can't bury it." "How?" I asked. He gave a humorless smile. "By using the same fear he used on everyone else." Before we could ask more, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then swore under his breath. "He knows I'm here." Ezekiel stood. "How? Because I didn't show up for my shift tonight. And nobody skips on Whitmore twice." He shoved the phone into his pocket. "I'll lead them away. You keep that evidence safe. If they catch me, don't come looking." I grabbed his arm. "You can't face him alone." He looked at me, eyes tired, but sure. "I've been running from his shadow for 40 years. Tonight I step out of it." Before I could stop him, he slipped out the back door into the rain. The darkness swallowed him whole. We waited for hours, listening for the sound of engines, for anything. Around 2 in the morning, Lydia arrived, soaked to the bone. "I saw his car," she said breathlessly. "My father's silver Mercedes. It was heading toward the old rail yard. And there were others with him." Ezekiel cursed under his breath. "They found him." I started for the door, but he caught my wrist. "You go, and they'll kill you too. I can't sit here while another man dies for my son." "Ruthie, no," I said, pulling free. "You heard what Mama said, truth don't come easy." Lydia stepped forward. "Let me go with you. I know the back roads better than anyone. If we hurry, we can get there before they do." We drove with the headlights off the rain, turning the dirt road into rivers of mud. My hands gripped the wheel tight enough to hurt. Every bend, every flash of lightning, I expected to see that silver car. When we reached the edge of the rail yard, the world seemed to hold its breath. The buildings loomed like skeletons in the rain. We moved quietly between them until we saw movement near the storage shed, shadows, flashlights, voices. I recognized Richard's voice even before I saw him. Smooth. Cold. Commanding. "Find him," he said. "I want those files back before dawn." We ducked behind an old freight car. My heart pounded so loud I thought he'd hear it. One of the men called out, "Over here!" There was a scuffle, a shout, then a single gunshot. Lydia gasped, her hand over her mouth. I grabbed her wrist, forcing her to stay still. Through the rain, I saw 2 men dragging a body toward the car. Even from the distance, I knew it was Jerome. Richard bent down, said something I couldn't hear, then walked back to his Mercedes. The taillights glowed red as the car disappeared into the storm. We stayed there until the last engine faded. Lydia was shaking uncontrollably. "He's dead," she whispered. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Then he died, giving us the proof we need. We went to the spot where they'd left him. The rain washed over everything, but his coat was still warm when I touched it. I reached into the pocket and felt something hard, a flash drive wrapped in plastic. Ezekiel's headlights appeared in the distance. When he saw us, he ran over, his face pale. "I told you to stay back, we found it," I said, holding up the drive. "He hid this before they came." He stared at it, then nodded slowly. "Then Jerome didn't die for nothing." We covered his body with a tarp and said nothing for a long time. The rain eased to a drizzle again, and in the silence that followed, I could almost hear Mama's voice. "The truth has a price, but it always pays back double." When we drove home, dawn was beginning to break. The clouds parted just enough for light to spill over the fields. I looked at the flash drive in my hand, small but heavy with everything we'd lost. Lydia leaned her head against the window, her eyes hollow. "My father will never stop," she said softly. I nodded. "Neither will we." Ezekiel glanced at me in the mirror. "What now?" I looked out at the rising sun, its light cutting through the last of the rain. "Now we finish what Mama started." And for the first time in a long while, I felt Daniel's presence beside me, not in pain, not in grief, but in strength. The storm had taken enough from us. It was time for us to give it back. The sun hadn't yet cleared the trees when Lydia knocked on the door. Her eyes were red from crying, her hands trembling as she clutched a small purse against her chest. Ezekiel and I had barely slept. The flash drive from Jerome sat in the middle of the table, glinting faintly under the kitchen light like something alive. "He's gone, isn't he?" Lydia asked, voice breaking. I nodded. "Your father made sure of it." She looked down at her hand, silent for a long time. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a small golden key. "This is for his private safe deposit box at Southern Federal Bank," she said. "He told me once that it's where he keeps cash for special projects. If I can get inside, we'll have proof, money, trails, names, everything." Ezekiel leaned back in his chair, studying her. "That's risky, girl. He'll have people watching the bank." "He's in meetings until afternoon," she said quickly. "If I go early, no one will question it. They all think I handle his estate papers." I wanted to stop her to keep her safe. But I saw in her eyes the same resolve that had carried me through every storm of my life. "If you do this," I told her softly, "there's no turning back." "I know," she said. "He already took my husband. I won't let him destroy what's left." She left at dawn, and the silence that followed was unbearable. I busied myself with small things, washing dishes that were already clean, refilling the coffee pot that neither of us touched. Ezekiel sat by the window, watching the road like a man expecting ghosts. "Do you think she'll make it?" I asked finally. He didn't answer for a long time. "If she's half as stubborn as you, yeah." By 10, the phone rang. I snatched it up before the second ring. Lydia's whisper came through, shaky but urgent. "I'm inside. He has over 200,000 in cash here, and I found envelopes labeled with the same names from your mother's notebook. There's also a ledger marked Sunrise Development. I'm taking photos of everything." "Get out as soon as you're done," I said. She didn't respond right away. "Someone's coming. I have to go." The line went dead. I froze, the phone still pressed to my ear. Ezekiel stood up slowly. "That was too quick." She said someone was there. He grabbed his keys. "Let's move." The drive into town felt longer than it ever had. My heart pounded so hard it drowned out the engine's hum. We pulled up 2 blocks from the bank, parking behind a delivery truck. From there, we could see the entrance, clean glass doors reflecting the sunlight, guards in dark suits posted outside. "She's still in there," Ezekiel said. "Her car's out front." We waited, every second stretching thin as thread. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Finally the doors opened and Lydia stepped out. She looked composed, calm, even walking as though she belonged to that building. But when she reached the corner, she slipped her hand into her pocket and glanced back once. I saw the fear, then the kind that knows it's being watched. She climbed into our truck and exhaled shakily. "I did it," she said, pulling out her phone. "Everything's here. Photos, documents. Enough to burn him down." Ezekiel drove while she scrolled through the images. Receipts for land purchases under shell companies, withdrawals of cash to pay contractors, and scanned letters from local officials promising discretion. "Look at this one," she said, turning the screen toward me. "A payment order for $2,000 to someone named GRZ. That's the code Jerome mentioned." "That's the man who killed my son," I whispered. By the time we reached home, the clouds had rolled in again. Lydia uploaded the photos to an external drive, her fingers moving fast. "We need to back this up 3 times, she said. "My father will notice soon." "He already does," Ezekiel muttered, pointing to the end of the driveway. A dark SUV sat idling there, the same one that had been watching us before. "Inside," I hissed. We ducked low behind the curtains as Ezekiel watched through the slit. 2 men sat in the front seat, silhouettes, too still to be casual. After 10 minutes, they drove off. But the unease they left behind didn't fade. Lydia sat back at the table, her hands shaking as she held the flash drive from Jerome and the new photos she'd taken. "We need to get this to someone who can actually do something," she said. "The state police won't help. The sheriff's, his man. But the U.S. Attorney's Office in Jackson, maybe." Ezekiel nodded. "I've got a contact there. A friend from the service. He'll listen." Before he could make the call, the phone rang again. I picked up, expecting Lydia's father. But the voice on the line was distorted, mechanical. "If you want justice for the boy," it said, "come to the Old City Cemetery at 10 tonight. Come alone. I have information you'll want." Then silence. Ezekiel frowned. "Could be a trap. Could be help," I said. Lydia stood pale. "If my father finds out you're meeting anyone, he'll assume I told you. He's already paranoid." I looked at her. "You've done enough today. Stay here. Lock the doors. If we're not back by midnight, drive to Aunt Clara's in Jackson and hand this to the authorities yourself." She wanted to argue, but I could see exhaustion winning. She nodded. "Just promise me you'll be careful." The rest of the day moved like a storm waiting to break. Ezekiel gathered what we had: Mama's ledger, Jerome's tapes, Lydia's photos. I packed sandwiches neither of us ate. By the time the sun set, I'd stopped trembling. Fear had burned itself into steel. At 9:30, we left. The road to the cemetery was narrow and unlit, flanked by trees that leaned inward like watchers. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth. When we pulled up, the gates creaked open and fog hung low across the graves. "There," Ezekiel whispered, pointing. A figure stood near the old stone mausoleum, tall and motionless, a cap pulled low over his face. We approached slowly, the crunch of gravel underfoot echoing in the stillness. "You, the family?" the man asked. "Yes," I said. "Who are you?" He glanced around before stepping closer. "Name's Daryl. Used to work for Whitmore. I took those photos of your son's beating. Thought it was just another job, until I saw what they did to him. Been running ever since." He handed Ezekiel a sealed envelope. "Everything I have, copies of contracts, recordings, proof he paid the cops to look the other way. There's even a tape where he admits ordering the hit on Wallace Green back in 19. Ezekiel opened it just enough to see stacks of papers inside. "Why now?" he asked. Daryl's expression hardened. "Because my brother's next. He still works for Whitmore, calls himself the Fixer. Said the old man offered him $50,000 to make your family disappear before this goes public." I felt the ground shift beneath me. "When?" "Tomorrow. 3 o'clock. He plans to stage a car accident on the mountain highway." Ezekiel's grip on the envelope tightened. "Then we've got less than 12 hours. Daryl looked over his shoulder. "You didn't hear this from me. If he finds out, I'm as good as dead." "Wait," I said. "Where do we find your brother?" He hesitated. "St. Michael's Church. He'll meet you there at noon if you bring proof you're not working for Whitmore." Then he was gone, swallowed by the fog. We stood there a long time, listening to the rain start again. Ezekiel finally exhaled. "He's giving us a chance." "A dangerous one," I said. He handed me the envelope. "You still up for it?" I looked down at the graves around us, the names worn smooth by time. Somewhere among them was my son's resting place. "For Daniel," I said. "Always." As we walked back to the truck, lightning flashed across the sky bright enough to show the whole cemetery in a single breath of light. It looked like an army of the dead watching us leave. The wind rose, carrying the scent of rain. And something else, hope maybe, or warning. Either way, I wasn't afraid anymore. Because now we weren't just chasing the truth. We were racing time. The bell of St. Michael's Church rang once, echoing through the empty streets. The town still slept beneath a layer of fog that clung to the ground like smoke. Ezekiel parked the truck behind the parish garden where the wild roses grew thick along the fence. The air smelled of rain and old stone. Inside, the church was dim. Candles flickered near the altar, their flames bending with the draft that slipped through cracked stained glass windows. A man sat in the last pew, his shoulders tense, his head bowed. When we approached, he looked up and I knew instantly who he was. He had Jerome's eyes. "Trey," he said, extending a trembling hand. "Jerome was my brother." Ezekiel nodded. "We know. He died helping us." Trey closed his eyes for a moment, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "He called me that night. Told me he'd finally done something right. I didn't understand until I saw the news. Your boy, the beating everything. I've been waiting for you." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small case, setting it on the pew beside him. "This is everything Whitmore's ever made me do. Contracts, payoffs, names. And..." His voice broke, proof that he ordered the hit on my brother when he found out he talked to you. I stared at the case, my chest tight. "Why help us now?" He met my eyes. "Because I'm tired of burying good men for a bad one. And because I've got a daughter he threatened to kill if I didn't take this job. I can't let him own her future too." Ezekiel unfolded the envelope Daryl had given us the night before, showing him the documents. "Your brother told us you'd meet here. Said you wanted protection." Trey nodded. "He wasn't wrong. But I want more than that. I want him to fall. You have the flash drive from Jerome." I pulled it from my coat pocket. "Safe and copied." "Good," he said, "because what's on there ties directly to the files I've got here. Together, it's enough to bury him forever." He opened the case. Inside were printed photographs, bank ledgers, and a recorder with a small digital screen still blinking red. "This one's from last night," he said. "Richard talking to his lawyer about cleaning up the mess. He mentioned your names, Ruth and Ezekiel Jones. Said you were next." My blood ran cold. "He's planning something for today." Trey nodded grimly. 3 o'clock. The same plan he used on Wallace Green years ago. Car accident, no survivors. "My men were supposed to run you off the highway near Crescent Hill." Ezekiel clenched his fists. "Then we've got less than 3 hours to stop him." Before we could speak further, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Trey turned sharply. "He's early," he whispered. "You two hide behind the altar. If this goes wrong, take the case and run." We ducked behind the heavy curtain just as the church doors creaked open. Richard Whitmore's voice filled the space, smooth and controlled, like a man giving orders at a dinner party. "Trey," he called, "I hope you didn't think I wouldn't find out about your little meeting." Trey's tone shifted, steady but tense. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Whitmore. This is sacred ground." Richard laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Don't pretend you suddenly found God. You've been my right hand for years. You think one act of charity changes that? I'm done doing your dirty work," Trey said. "Oh, I don't think you are," Richard replied. His shoes clicked against the floor as he moved closer. "You're going to finish one last job for me, because if you don't, that daughter of yours won't live to see another sunrise." Ezekiel's hand brushed mine. He mouthed, "Record it." I hit the button on our small tape recorder, the same one Mama had used to capture her thoughts decades ago. Trey's voice hardened. "You've already killed my brother. You think I'll let you touch my child?" Richard's tone dropped to a whisper so cold it felt like the temperature in the church had fallen. "You forget who owns this town, boy. You forget who decides which names get carved in stone and which get wiped away." A click echoed, metal sliding against metal. "A gun." "Please," Trey said. "Don't do this here." But Richard never believed in mercy. The gunshot shattered the silence, and Trey fell to his knees. The echo rang against the stone walls like a bell tolling for the dead. I bit down on a scream, pressing my hand over my mouth. Ezekiel's face was stone. Richard's voice came again, calm as ever. "Clean this up," he said to someone else, another man, footsteps heavier. "Make sure the body disappears." The man's voice answered, rough and unfamiliar. "And the Jones family, soon," Richard said. "This afternoon." When the doors finally closed behind them, I rushed to Trey's side. He was still breathing barely. Blood soaked through his shirt, warm and slick beneath my hands. Don't let him win," he gasped. "Take it, all of it." Ezekiel knelt beside me. "You're gonna make it, son. Stay with us." But Trey's hand went limp, his eyes fixed on the cross above the altar. I closed them gently and whispered, "Rest easy, child. We'll finish it for you." We took the case and ran. Outside, the air was heavy with humidity, and sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Ezekiel drove without headlights, taking the back roads toward Jackson. "If we can reach the city before 3, we'll hand this to the U.S. attorney and the reporter Lydia mentioned." I held the recorder in my lap. Trey's final confrontation still playing in my ears. Each word was another nail in Richard's coffin. As we reached the outskirts of town, Lydia called. "He knows," she said, her voice shaking. "My father's furious. He found out about the bank this morning and sent men to the house. I barely got away." "Where are you now?" I asked. "At the old bridge by County Road. I can meet you halfway." Ezekiel nodded, accelerating. "Tell her to stay hidden till we get there." We reached the bridge just as the church bell struck 1. Lydia waved us down, her clothes muddy, her eyes wild. "He's on his way," she said. "He knows you've been talking to the press." I handed her the recorder and the case. "Then we make sure he can't silence us again." Ezekiel parked the truck beneath the bridge, the river rushing below. "We need a diversion," he said. "Something to draw his men away while we get the files to Jackson." Lydia looked at him. "He'll be expecting you on the main road. But I know another way, a maintenance trail that cuts through the old quarry. It's rough, but faster." "Then that's our route," he said. I glanced at the horizon. Clouds were gathering again, thunder rolling like a warning. "He's not stopping this time," I whispered. Ezekiel met my eyes. "Neither are we." We packed everything into waterproof bags. Mama's ledger, the flash drives, the photos, the recordings, and loaded them under the back seat. Lydia climbed into the truck beside me, her hands gripping the folder so tightly the edges tore. "He'll never forgive me," she said. "He doesn't have to," I told her. "You don't need forgiveness from the devil." As we pulled away from the bridge, a single black car appeared on the distant hill. Its headlights cut through the fog, growing larger every second. "He's coming," Ezekiel said quietly. I looked back at the church spire, fading into the mist. Somewhere inside those stone walls, Trey Carter's blood was still fresh. And for the first time since my son's death, I felt something fierce and unshakable rise in me. It wasn't fear. It was purpose. "Drive," I told my brother. "Let him follow. By the time this day is over, the whole world will know what Richard Whitmore really is." And as we sped toward the city, the storm finally broke, rain slashing against the windshield like glass, baptizing the road ahead in the name of justice. The rain turned the world into a blur of motion and noise. Wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear, lightning flashed across the sky, and thunder rolled like the voice of something ancient and angry. Ezekiel's hands gripped the wheel, the veins in his arms standing out. Lydia sat between us, clutching the waterproof bag like a lifeline. Every few seconds, she looked back, watching for headlights in the distance. "They're gaining," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. I turned around. 2 black SUVs cut through the rain, their headlights glowing like predator eyes. My pulse quickened. "He's not sending men this time," I whispered. "He's coming himself." Ezekiel pressed harder on the gas. "Let him. He'll follow us straight to his own ruin." The road wound through the hills, narrow and slick. Water pooled in dips, making the truck slide just enough to set my teeth on edge. I prayed under my breath, not for safety, but for strength. We had come too far to stop now. At the base of Crescent Hill, Lydia pointed toward a gravel path barely visible through the rain. "Turn there, it leads to the old quarry road. No cameras, no patrols. Ezekiel jerked the wheel, the tires screeching as we left the main road. The SUVs followed, their engines roaring. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating the landscape in blinding white. For one brief second, I saw Richard Whitmore's silver Mercedes leading the chase, his face visible behind the glass, calm, focused, cold. "He's here," I said. "He's driving himself." "Good," Ezekiel growled. "Then we end it here." The trail narrowed, mud splattering against the truck. Trees whipped past on both sides, branches scraping the doors. The quarry loomed ahead, an open pit with jagged cliffs and a deep pool of black water at the bottom. Ezekiel braked hard, stopping near the edge. "Out," he ordered. "We can't risk him running us off." Lydia and I jumped out, rain drenching us instantly. Ezekiel grabbed the bag of evidence and slung it over his shoulder. "We'll take the footpath to the highway," he said. "Once we hit town, we can find a payphone and call the feds." But the roar of engines cut through the storm again. The SUVs stopped 50 yards away. The silver Mercedes pulled up last, its headlights washing over us. The doors opened. 4 men stepped out, armed, hard-faced, silent. Then Richard appeared, an umbrella over his head, his white shirt spotless despite the rain. "Well," he said, smiling thinly, "the country family really knows how to put on a show." "Turn back, Richard," I shouted over the thunder. "It's over. We have everything, your contracts, your recordings, your blood money." He laughed. "You think a few papers and tapes can touch me? I built this county. You wouldn't have electricity in your little farmhouse if not for me." Ezekiel moved closer, standing between him and us. "You didn't build it," he said. "You stole it. You destroyed families for it. That ends today." Richard's smile vanished. "You people never learn your place." He snapped his fingers and 2 of his men raised their guns. "Hand over the bag and maybe I'll let you live long enough to remember this lesson." Lydia stepped forward, trembling but defiant. "You won't shoot me, Father." He turned his cold eyes on her. "Don't test me, girl. You've already shamed this family more than your mother ever did." "I'm nothing like you," she said. Rain streamed down her face, mixing with tears. "You taught me that love was weakness. But it's the only reason I'm standing here, and the reason you're going to prison." Something shifted in Richard's expression, just a flicker, quickly buried under rage. "Then you're no daughter of mine." Before anyone could move, Ezekiel threw the truck's headlights on full beam, blinding them. "Run!" he shouted. We dove toward the tree line as gunfire cracked through the storm. Bullets tore into the truck, glass shattering. I felt Lydia stumble beside me and grabbed her hand. "Keep going!" I yelled. Ezekiel ducked behind a boulder, returning fire with the pistol he carried. One of Richard's men fell. The others took cover behind the cars. Lightning flashed again, and I saw Richard retreating toward his Mercedes, shouting orders. His men followed, reloading. Ezekiel fired again, forcing them back. "Get the bag to safety," he shouted. "I'll hold them off." "No," I cried, but he was already moving, circling toward the vehicles. The storm swallowed him whole. Lydia and I ran along the ridge, slipping on wet rocks. The ground trembled beneath us as thunder rolled overhead. Below, headlights weaved wildly near the quarry's edge. Then a single gunshot echoed louder than the rest, followed by the sound of tires skidding, metal screaming, and a splash that seemed to go on forever. I turned. The silver Mercedes was gone. Only ripples spread across the dark water below. Lydia froze. "He's gone." Ezekiel emerged from the shadows, panting, soaked but alive. "The ground gave way under him," he said. "Tried to ram me and lost control." We stared down at the water. Rain kept falling, erasing every trace of the struggle. The surface stilled, silent, as if the earth itself had swallowed him. Lydia fell to her knees, sobbing. "It's over." I knelt beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "No, child," I said softly. "It's justice. The kind that doesn't wait for courts." Ezekiel stood over us, his face unreadable. "We still take this to the authorities. The others who helped him, they don't get to hide behind his ghost." By dawn, the rain had stopped. We made it to the highway, our clothes clinging to our skin, the evidence still safe in the bag. At a roadside diner, we found a payphone and called the federal office in Jackson. "This is Ruth Jones," I told the agent who answered. "We have proof of multiple murders and corruption involving Richard Whitmore. You'll find his car in the old quarry off County Road 17. The silence on the other end lasted only a moment before the agent replied, "Stay where you are, ma'am. We're sending a team." Within hours, black government cars arrived. Agents took statements, photographs, and the evidence. Ezekiel handed them the flash drives and recordings. I gave them Mama's ledger. Lydia sat quietly wrapped in a blanket one of the agents offered. "You did the right thing," the lead investigator told me. "These documents, this is enough to bring down everyone tied to him." I nodded, too tired to speak. When they left, the diner was quiet again. The first rays of sunlight slipped through the windows, painting gold lines across the cracked floor. Ezekiel poured us each a cup of coffee. "Feels strange," he said softly. "We spent months chasing justice. And now? Now we breathe," I said. "For Daniel. For Mama. For everyone who didn't live to see this morning." Lydia looked out the window, her voice barely above a whisper. "He'll still haunt me." "No," I told her. "Not if you remember who you are. You're not his blood, you're his consequence." She turned to me, eyes full of exhaustion and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Ezekiel smiled faintly. "You sure you're ready for what comes next? Reporters' trials, the whole circus." I looked at the dawn spreading over the wet fields and nodded. "We've lived in silence too long. Let them hear our story." Outside, the wind carried the smell of wet earth and magnolia. I thought of Daniel, of his laughter, his kindness, his stubborn heart, and whispered a promise to the morning air. "We did it, baby. You can rest now." Behind us, the radio crackled with breaking news. Local businessman Richard Whitmore presumed dead after vehicle accident in Greenwood County. Federal authorities confirm ongoing investigation into corruption and homicide charges linked to Whitmore's estate. Lydia began to cry again, not in grief but in release. Ezekiel reached across the table, taking her hand in mine. The three of us sat there as the sunlight broke fully across the horizon, warm and golden, chasing away the last of the storm. And for the first time in years, I felt peace settle deep inside me, not the quiet of forgetting, but the kind that comes when truth finally has a voice. 3 months after the storm, the world looked different. The fields were green again, the air smelled like honeysuckle, and the courthouse in Greenwood no longer felt like a place of fear. I stood on the steps that morning, watching people gather, neighbors, farmers, workers, families that had once whispered the Whitmore name like a curse. Now they came to see justice written into law. Ezekiel stood beside me, leaning on his cane. The scars on his arm had healed, but his eyes still carried the weight of every night we spent fighting shadows. Lydia arrived a few minutes later, her belly just beginning to show under her cotton dress. When she smiled, I saw Daniel in her face. "It's sentencing day," she said softly. "Yes," I replied. "The day we close the last chapter." Inside the courtroom, the air buzzed with whispers. Federal agents lined the walls. Reporters filled the benches. The judge entered, her robe heavy, her tone firm. "We are here to deliver judgment in the matter of United States versus Whitmore Estate and Associates." Even in death, Richard's empire stood on trial. His lawyers had tried to argue that his passing absolved his debts, that the dead couldn't stand accused. But the mountain of evidence, the ledgers, the recordings, the photographs, proved otherwise. His empire was built on stolen lives. And now, every dollar of it was being given back. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, we ask that the court approve the full forfeiture of all Whitmore assets and properties. We further request restitution to the victims' families and the establishment of a community fund in the name of those wrongfully taken." The judge nodded. Motion granted. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Tears filled my eyes. For once, the law had remembered the people it had forgotten for generations. After the hearing, a young reporter approached me on the courthouse steps. "Mrs. Jones," she said, holding a microphone. "You and your family exposed one of the largest corruption networks in the county's history. How does it feel to finally see justice served?" I thought of Mama's ledger, of Daniel's laughter, of the long nights when the truth was the only thing keeping us alive. It feels like sunlight after a long winter, I said. But justice isn't about revenge. It's about making sure no mother ever has to bury her child for telling the truth again. The reporter smiled. And what's next for you? I looked past her at the horizon where the town stretched wide and full of life. Rebuilding, I said. For all of us. That afternoon, Lydia invited us to the new community center being built downtown. It stood on land once owned by the Whitmore family, now donated to the people they had oppressed. The sign out front read, "The Daniel Jones Center for Integrity and Education." Children ran across the freshly paved courtyard, their laughter echoing through the air. Lydia led me inside where volunteers were setting up classrooms and a small library. On the wall hung a framed photo of Daniel smiling, eyes bright. Beneath it, a plaque read, "He believed truth was worth the cost." I traced my fingers over the words. "He would have liked this," I whispered. Lydia nodded, tears in her eyes. "I wanted something that would grow," she said. "Not just a memory, but a future." Ezekiel joined us carrying a box of donated books. "They're asking if you'll give the opening speech next week," he said. "I've spoken enough for one lifetime," I replied, smiling faintly. "Let the young ones speak now. It's their world to shape." He chuckled. "You sound like Mama." "Maybe I finally understand her," I said. As evening fell, we sat outside under the pecan trees. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass. Lydia leaned her head against my shoulder, humming an old hymn. "Sometimes I still dream about him," she said quietly. "Your son. He's always standing in the kitchen, smiling like everything's okay." I looked up at the darkening sky. "Maybe it is," I said. "Maybe he's trying to tell us we did right." Ezekiel nodded, his gaze distant. "The world moves on, Ruthie, but the good we do, it stays. Like seeds, takes time to bloom, but it blooms all the same." The next morning we went to visit Daniel's grave. The grass had grown thick over it and the marble marker gleamed after the rain. Lydia placed a small bouquet of wildflowers by the headstone. "I told you I'd protect what you loved," she whispered. I knelt beside her, running my fingers over his name. "Your father was wrong, baby," I said softly. "Love isn't weakness. It's the reason evil falls." We stayed there until the sun climbed high. When we left, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees, like a voice I'd known all my life. "Keep going, Ruthie. There's still light left to share." Weeks later, the community center opened. Families filled the hall, laughter echoing off the walls. The mayor spoke about rebuilding trust, about new beginnings. But when it came time to unveil the dedication plaque, the crowd turned to me. I stepped forward, the weight of 100 eyes on my back, and looked out at the people gathered, people who had lived too long under fear. "This isn't about one family," I said, my voice steady. "It's about all of us. About choosing to remember when it would be easier to forget. About teaching our children that silence can be broken, and that even the smallest voice can shake the tallest wall." Applause rose like thunder and I felt something warm move through me, hope fierce and alive. After the ceremony, Lydia took my hand. "There's someone I want you to meet." She led me to the nursery room where a small crib stood by the window. Inside, a newborn slept peacefully wrapped in a pale blue blanket. "His name's David," she said. "After your husband." Tears blurred my vision. I reached out and touched the baby's tiny hand. His fingers curled around mine, strong and certain. "Welcome to the world, little one," I whispered. "Your family's got a story for you, one worth remembering." That night, I sat on the porch of the farmhouse, the same chair where Mama used to rock me to sleep. The air was warm, the stars scattered like promises. The sound of laughter drifted from the kitchen where Ezekiel and Lydia washed dishes, their voices mingling with the hum of crickets. The phone rang once, and for a heartbeat, I was back in that terrible night when the world had broken. But this time, it wasn't fear in my chest, it was peace. It was Aunt Clara calling to tell me that the clinic downtown, funded by restitution money, had opened its doors that morning. Free healthcare for every family in Greenwood County. I hung up the phone and smiled. Mama's voice echoed softly in my mind. "When truth finally wins, it doesn't just punish, it heals." I looked toward the horizon where the last light of day faded into deep blue. "We made it, Mama," I whispered. "You, me, Daniel, all of us. The storm's gone." Somewhere in the night an owl called from the pecan tree, slow and solemn. I closed my eyes, letting the sound settle into my bones. For the first time in years, sleep came easy. And as I drifted off, I dreamed of Daniel standing on the road at midnight, not bleeding, not broken, but smiling beneath the stars. "It's over, Mama," he said. "You can rest now." Did you like our story? Where are you listening from tonight? Tell me in the comments. I love hearing your thoughts. And if you want more stories about strength, truth, and family, don't forget to subscribe. There's always another story waiting for you right here, where justice always finds its way home.